Welcome back to another tutorial of the Intellijel Shapeshifter made by Intellijel. This tutorial is going to be covering two things, primarily the pulse output and the sync options. Both of these options can be found in the same menu. Right here it says sync/pulse. When you press it, you first get the sync options. When you press it again, you get the pulse options. We're going to be picking up from where we left off in the last tutorial with wave shaping. The pulse output can do a sort of wave shaping by looking at the features of either oscillator 1 or oscillator 2 or both of them together and output a signal that's either high or low. It's just a pulse. It's either on or off. And in that way, it actually gives us a sort of lo-fi version of all of these waveforms. So for example, if I were to listen to the output of oscillator 1, we have a sine wave. If we listen to the pulse output and choose from the options to listen to oscillator 1 positive, we're going to get a square wave because that sine wave is symmetrical above the center line and symmetrical below. So it has equal parts positive and negative in its waveform. That gives us equal parts high and low on the pulse output. Now if we were to choose a different waveform for oscillator 1, say, I don't know, something from the vocal 7 bank here, we can hear that we're getting unequal parts of positive and negative. As we sweep the shape, you'll hear that it changes. Now, if you own a crossfader, you can do a nice continuum between the output of oscillator 1, which is smooth, and the pulse output, which is very digital sounding. So I'm going to crossfade between, this is oscillator 1 output, and the pulse output. Moving on, the next option in the pulse menu here is the positive side of oscillator 2, which is going to be identical to what we just did. You just have a different waveform that you're choosing from. If I choose a different wave bank for oscillator 2, so you're getting a similar effect there. The next option is oscillator 2, the negative side, so this is the inverse of the positive. The next option is a logical OR, which looks at both the oscillators 1 and 2, and it does a logical operation just like we saw in the last tutorial. Let's listen to the output of oscillator 1, output of oscillator 2, and here's the OR operation on it. I'll change the frequency of oscillator 2. Don't forget you can use the quantize function here. I like getting really close, but not quite in tune. Between these two, it gets some really nice sounds. Almost like pulse width modulation sounds. The next operation in the pulse menu is a logical AND operation. AND is a little bit brighter. The next operation is exclusive OR, even brighter still. The final operation is glitch, just like we described earlier. It's sort of complicated. It has to do with phase shifting and basically gives you a pretty glitchy sound, and that's what you're going to get out of this. Now, the only other pulse output that I did not look at was EOC, that means end of cycle, and that only comes into effect when you're using percussion mode. Percussion mode is activated using this button right here. Whenever you get an input into the sync jack right here, it will trigger the output of output 1, and you can control the decay. It's a simple attack decay envelope that's built into it where the only parameter you have control over is decay. So let me go ahead and plug into output 1 here. And I'll go ahead and take a trigger from my LFO into the sync input. Now you can hear it's a very short envelope happening, and in order to make it a little bit longer, we want to activate the decay parameter right here, which I can turn on. You can see, just like all of the options on this side, we can press it a second time to give us access to this mod B to increase it. Let me show you the full decay there. I have a very long decay happening. Now, the reason I had to go into the percussion mode here was to describe the output of pulse end of cycle. You'll notice that I'm lighting up this LED right here that says pulse/LFO2, and that means that this pulse shape is actually repeating the clock that's coming out of this. What that means is we can essentially skip this whole business with the patch cable coming from the LFO, and we can self-patch the output of the pulse output into sync. And now whenever the end of cycle is reached, it will trigger another percussion envelope. You can see that there's some sort of break there, right? As I go from value 24 to 25, the envelope gets, the decay gets significantly larger. There's a few of those. I'll put the breakdown up on the screen right now. That was a design choice. Percussion mode actually has two functions. If I press it a second time, it gives us a sustain portion. That sustain portion is good if you have a gate signal coming in with a high and low output. So I'll go ahead and stop self-patching there and plug into my square wave output here. So you can hear that there's some sustain. I'll turn up the decay. I'll cycle back to percussion mode 1 is what I'll call it. So first press, there's no sustain, it's just decay based on this knob right here. Percussion mode 2 is now taking into account the high portion of this gate signal coming out, which is a square wave. So two different percussion modes and its use with the pulse output end of cycle. So next I'll be looking at the sync options. Sync has to do with the phase relationship between one oscillator and another. So let's take a look at hard sync. Hard sync will actually lock the phase of both oscillators 1 and 2 to an internal oscillator synchronization bus. This synchronization bus is turned on with internal sync, and like I said, we'll lock the phase of both oscillators 1 and 2. They sound different though. The reason is that internal synchronization bus is actually the same frequency as oscillator 1. So if you think about it, locking the phase of oscillator 1 to the same frequency as itself, it doesn't really do anything. So here's oscillator 1, and our internal synchronization bus is up, and we're set to hard sync, but nothing really happens. Now here's the trick to doing this. One way to override that synchronization and to actually hear some hard sync going on here is we need to turn up the FM potentiometer. That FM is going to override the frequency that is being sent to oscillator 1, and it's going to create some hard sync like effect. So if we turn this up, I'll turn off internal sync just so you can hear it. It's going to be FM. right? Now compare that to the output of oscillator 2, where we'll only hear the hard sync effect if we turn up its frequency. So it sounds completely different. So oscillator 1 in this case is a combination of frequency modulation with a hard sync effect, whereas oscillator 2 is simply hard sync by itself, hard syncing to the frequency of oscillator 1, or more technically that internal synchronization bus. The next sync option is soft sync. Now hard sync is going to reset the phase of the oscillators by the internal bus frequency. Soft sync is going to do the exact same thing, only if the oscillators are in their first quarter of their cycle. What it amounts to is that sometimes a synchronization event occurs and sometimes it doesn't. So we'll listen to the output of first oscillator 1. It's a frequency modulated oscillator sync. And now oscillator 2, which is synchronization only. The next type of sync is reverse sync. This one's pretty cool. It will reverse the direction of the wave of either oscillator 1 or 2 when a sync event occurs. So here's the output of oscillator 1. And oscillator 2. The next sync mode is hold/one shot. This is actually two different modes combined. Hold affects output 1. When you get a clock input from, say, an LFO into the sync input here, it will cause the output of output 1 to freely cycle through its waveform. The next clock input will freeze it wherever it's at, and it will just alternate back and forth between free running and frozen output. And this is what that sounds like. As you can hear, it's sort of a gating effect. One-shot mode refers to output 2. One shot will trigger a single cycle of the waveform on every clock, and that's what this sounds like. Now those aren't terribly exciting on their own. They actually become very interesting when you run this module in LFO mode, something that I've actually not spent a whole lot of time discussing, but is really ripe with possibilities. So if we set the module into LFO mode, we can actually reduce the need to use an external LFO. So when we set the module into LFO mode on both oscillators, we can use our internal sync here to trigger the output of output 2 at low frequencies. Again, output 2 is one-shot mode, so it's going to cycle a single, it's going to do one cycle of a waveform, and it's actually really useful for doing stuff like envelopes or just anything that needs to be a LFO that's synchronized with the clock input. So what I've set up here is a noise oscillator going into a VCA, and we're going to use the output of output 2 here as an LFO to shape the amplitude of this envelope. So before I do that, let's go ahead and switch to a different oscillator bank for oscillator 2, output 2. We'll switch to one of these LFO, let's choose this one. One of these LFO banks. They're specialized banks that are perfect for doing this sort of one-shot envelope type output. So output of 2 is going into a VCA, which has a noise oscillator input. And let's take a listen. So in this case, the ratio is the speed of that single cycle that's being triggered, so we can slow that down. And the coarse output is actually the speed of the triggering. So if we slow that down, There's a single shot right there. And we can change the wavebank of oscillator 2. With both these oscillators set into LFO mode, you could actually take the output of both 1 and 2 and say combine them, mix them together, and use those as a sort of compound CV signal. So I'm going to go ahead and try that. Here's output 1, output 2. And right now, output 1 is actually not super interesting. It's still set to the basic waveform, so we can go ahead and choose another LFO signal here. And you can see that these LEDs are actually really helpful once we're in LFO mode. They show both the pulse output and the outputs from 1 and 2. You can actually hear them really audibly as they're flashing. One way you can use the hold mode to sort of simulate percussion mode in a really flexible way is to set the module into combo mode ring modulation. And you'll remember ring modulation is a type of amplitude modulation. So in effect, if we run output 2 in LFO mode, we can use that as our envelope shape, and we can listen to the output of output 1. So there's output 1. You'll notice I have it on, output 1 is just on a basic wave shape here. And output 2 I put on one of the LFO shapes. We can use an external clock to go into the sync input. So now we have control over the clock, obviously, over here with our LFO. And then we have the speed of the LFO's envelope controlled by the ratio time knob. There's a lot of cool possibilities in using this module as an LFO, and I certainly have not spent enough time showing those off, but definitely start to explore the cool possibilities doing self-triggering with both oscillators 1 and 2 in LFO mode, and using one-shot slash hold mode. So in bump sync, oscillator 1, every time a synchronization event occurs, oscillator 1 is going to be bumped in its phase by 1/4 of the phase. Oscillator 2 will be bumped by 1/8 of its phase. Okay, the final sync mode is 2 = 1 sync. There's also, if you check it out, there's a 1 equals 2 mode here. They're very similar to hard sync, and they're very similar to each other. The difference between these two modes and hard sync is that there's an additional synchronization event that occurs when oscillator 1 equals oscillator 2. And it creates some pretty interesting chirping type sounds, some like kind of cat-like sounds, especially out of oscillator output 2 in 2 to 1 or 2 equals 1 mode, and conversely out of output 1 when you're in 1 equals 2 mode. Okay, so let's start with the first one here and listen to output 2. I should say before I plug it in that choosing the wavetable actually makes a huge difference here, as does playing with the coarse and ratio knobs. They'll change the sound immensely just with the smallest tweak. So with that in mind, let's take a listen. And let's listen to 1 to 2 coming out of output 1. By the way, the opposite output, so in this case output 2, and in this case output 1, are doing the same thing as hard sync, so that's why I'm skipping those. So this is output 1 in 1 equals 2 mode. So you can see there's a lot of sonic possibilities there, lots of time to waste just playing with that particular mode. And with that, we've concluded our look at both synchronization options and pulse options, and we also looked at the percussion mode briefly. Lots of fun to be had with all three of those. This was just a very brief overview of them. Hopefully it's given you a little bit of something to go on and start to experiment. Remember not to forget any of the other things we've looked at. These can be used with combo mode, in combination with the combo mode, and of course tilt. It can add further variation to both your pulse output and your synchronization outputs, and your synchronization schemes that are going to be enacted on outputs 1 and 2. And of course you can use the synchronization schemes in combination with the pulse output to create even further variation. And if you want to keep calling it wave shaping, we can call it that. It starts to enter the domain of mangling, and just simply it's just a realm of digital effects, and it's